Less than a week before Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene resigns from office, she's making new allegations in her fallout with President Trump over the Epstein files. In a New York Times interview, Greene says Trump privately told her, quote, "My friends will get hurt if alleged abusers connected to Epstein were exposed." In a statement, the White House says, quote, "Congresswoman Greene is quitting on her constituents in the middle of her term and abandoning the consequential fight we're in. We don't have time for her petty bitterness." So for more on all this, I want to bring in our Capitol Hill correspondent, Jay O'Brien. And Jay, this New York Times piece, it's pretty meaty, 18 pages here. But what are we learning more on this alleged conversation between the president and the Congresswoman?
Hello and welcome, guys. Dr. John is here. So what is happening right now is absolutely massive. The MAGA coalition is detonating in public. And the most revealing part isn't the policy splits. It's the sudden, unconvincing emergence of conscience from the people who spent years calling critics traitors.
So this is a phone call, Alex, that Marjorie Taylor Greene has talked about before. It comes when Marjorie Taylor Greene was one of that handful of House Republicans who were defying President Trump and signing on to legislation to force the release of the so-called Jeffrey Epstein files the Department of Justice has. This is legislation that ultimately passed, remember, the House and the Senate. And after President Trump first opposed it, he ultimately signed it into law. But in the initial stages of that effort, when Marjorie Taylor Greene was one of just those handful of Republicans stepping to the president on this issue, that's when this phone call, Greene says, took place. And as you say, she goes into more detail in this interview in the Times about it. And she says that in her recollection, President Trump said to her that one of the reasons for his opposition to the release of these Epstein files was that his quote unquote friends could get hurt. Now, that is only Greene's recollection. We haven't heard from the president.
Now that the political weather has turned, they want a seat at the table they tried to burn down. They want the redemption arc without the reckoning. The people who absorbed the death threats, the lost jobs, the professional destruction for opposing Trump when it was genuinely dangerous are delivering one answer: no. You don't get to pour gasoline on democratic institutions for years, and then, when the flames reach your own career, suddenly discover your principles. A distinction must be drawn here because the conversation keeps collapsing into false equivalence.
One way or the other on this, and it's been clear that Greene and the president have had a very serious falling out because of her support of the release of these Epstein files. And so, putting aside the details of this call for a second, it is just another fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump have had this very public breakup over this issue that at one point was critical to President Trump's MAGA base, was a campaign promise of President Trump's to put out whatever they could about the Jeffrey Epstein case, Alex.
Yeah, well, and she, by her recollection, talks about him yelling at her via speakerphone over this. But I'm curious, I mean, what are you hearing on Capitol Hill about this interview?
It's not necessarily the Epstein stuff that is really taking center stage with Republicans I talked to, not necessarily about this piece, but about the broader Trump-Greene breakup. Really what the Republicans I've talked to take issue with is Marjorie Taylor Greene's concerns that President Trump has abandoned.
And the distinction is essential. There are two completely separate categories of people currently experiencing what the pundits are calling buyer's remorse, and they demand completely separate responses. The first category is the regular voter, the person in suburban Ohio or rural Georgia, or the sprawling exurbs of Arizona who absorbed the promises and believed them. Lower costs, no new foreign entanglements, an America First agenda that would prioritize the needs of working citizens over the appetites of distant elites.
What she says is his MAGA base. That's been something she's been saying for the last few weeks now. It's been her view that President Trump abandoned the promises he made when he ran for re-election in 2024, has left, she says, that base of voters behind that talked about affordability, that talked about transparency when it comes to the Epstein files, and a number of other promises that President Trump made. And it's her view that President Trump has distanced himself from those voters in the pursuit of other things. Now, the Republicans I talked to on Capitol Hill largely take issue with Greene's characterization there, but they are concerned that Marjorie Taylor Greene could potentially give air cover to some other disaffected Republicans. And you might see, and it's Greene's hope that you do you see, she has said this publicly, this kind of groundswell of other Republicans coming out and publicly criticizing the president, publicly taking issue with the way that he has so far conducted his second term.
Well, and listen, Greene certainly has a platform, at least for the next several days. But as we mentioned, she's not seeking re-election, and she only has a few days left in Congress. So do we have any ideas to what's next for her?
An economy set to roar back to life. Tips that would escape taxation. A life that was supposed to become more affordable and more secure. That person, the ordinary working American who cast a ballot based on the representations that were made to them and has since watched those representations fail to materialize, that person who is now reconsidering their choice deserves something very different. They were sold a product. The product was defective. Their grievance is authentic.
She's not just not seeking re-election, she's leaving early, right? She's going to end her term on January 5th, this coming Monday. She's going to resign early. There's going to be a special election to fill that seat. So she only has a few more days left as a member of the House of Representatives. And to your point, one of the questions hanging over Marjorie Taylor Greene is what is next for her. She has said she's walking away from politics, that she's no longer going to be in the political fray. But there is this active question right now amongst Republicans, particularly in the president's MAGA coalition, of how much of a voice of opposition does Marjorie Taylor Greene become having left Congress. She won't have the platform of a sitting member of Congress, but she's obviously a household name. She was perhaps the closest to Donald Trump amongst House Republicans for such a long time. She was synonymous with the MAGA movement on Capitol Hill. So she still has a voice. And the question is, does she deploy that voice even more critically against President Trump after she has left Congress? That is a concern of some Republican leaders I've talked to.
It is legitimate, and the door should be held wide open for them. They are not the architects of this disaster. They are the casualties of it. The second category is entirely different, and it is this category that is currently generating the most public friction. Category 2 consists of the politicians who stood at podiums in the aftermath of January 6th and calculated that the smart play was to move on, to look forward, to refuse accountability, because accountability would be costly. It consists of the media figures with audiences numbering in the millions who dedicated years of their platforms to constructing a reality in which Trump was functionally infallible, in which every scandal was a fabrication, every critic was a deep state operative, and every legal defeat was proof of the conspiracy against him. It consists of the donors who signed the checks that kept the machinery running, the operatives who designed and executed the campaigns, the podcast hosts who platformed every cascading conspiracy theory with a knowing grin, treating the erosion of their listeners' grip on reality as an acceptable price for download numbers. These people possessed information. These people possessed access. They were not duped by a politician who broke his word. They were insiders who watched the dynamics unfold from the closest possible vantage point and made deliberate, calculated, frequently profitable choices about how to respond. And now that the political winds have shifted, now that the polling has soured, now that the money is drying up and the audiences are fracturing, they wish to rebrand themselves as individuals who have simply and honestly reconsidered. No, that is not how the accounting works. The fury directed at these figures, the fury captured in that reaction clip, is not merely emotional catharsis. It is a morally and politically coherent stance. Because the media establishment keeps treating this moment as though a grand reconciliation is achievable, as though Marjorie Taylor Greene deserves a measure of credit for finally expressing exasperation, as though a big unifying coalition can be assembled from the fragments if only everyone is sufficiently gracious. But Marjorie Taylor Greene did not spend a few awkward months flirting with a bad political tendency. She spent years. She showed up to committee hearings in a gas mask to mock public health precautions. She injected election denialism into the bloodstream of the Republican base with an enthusiasm and a reach that surpassed even Trump's own efforts. She publicly labeled the survivors of school shootings as crisis actors, inflicting unimaginable additional trauma on children and families already shattered by violence, and she did it in service of a political brand that profited from cruelty. And now, because she is dissatisfied with a handful of Trump's decisions, because the internal dynamics of the caucus have become less comfortable for her, that is supposed to count as a meaningful evolution. You do not receive a commendation for discovering the truth in the final hour after spending every previous hour actively preventing everyone else from accessing it. You do not get to spend years as a willing architect of the post-truth environment, and then, when that environment becomes inconvenient to your own ambitions, present yourself as a penitent. The timing here, as with everything in politics, is not coincidental. Trump is constitutionally barred from seeking another term. He is a lame duck, and everyone inside the ecosystem understands exactly what that means. The real battlefield is the midterms, and control of Congress is the prize that will determine whether the next phase of American politics is shaped by this movement or by the opposition to it. And suddenly, as if responding to a signal that only they can hear, voices that were silent or actively hostile to any criticism of Trump are discovering the stirrings of their conscience. That is not moral awakening. That is electoral arithmetic. These individuals examined the polling data, scrutinized the fundraising reports, absorbed the temperature readings from their home districts and media markets, and arrived at a calculation. The calculation is not a values transformation. It is a survival strategy, wearing the borrowed clothes of a values transformation, and the seams are visible to anyone who cares to look. The question that almost nobody in the mainstream press is willing to articulate with sufficient bluntness is this: what would happen to the Republican Party if the individuals currently cycling through their buyer's remorse were actually compelled to answer substantively for what they did, not in a single tweet that will be buried by the algorithm within hours, not on a friendly television program where a sympathetic host nods along and gently guides them toward their talking points. Actually answer for it under conditions where the full historical record is admissible. What did you say in the immediate aftermath of the insurrection? What did you say when the first impeachment was gavelled? What did you say when the classified documents were discovered in a ballroom? What did you say to your audiences, your donors, your constituents, your followers? Because the receipts are not lost. They have never been lost. They are sitting in archives, in screenshots, in databases searchable and retrievable by anyone with an internet connection and a functioning memory. The frustrating reality of American political journalism is that it possesses a catastrophically abbreviated attention span and an almost compulsive appetite for redemption narratives that have not been substantively earned. The person in that clip is not interested in providing that redemption narrative as a gift, and neither, frankly, should anyone else who was conscious during the years when the damage was being inflicted. There is a dimension to this fracturing that extends beyond simple political positioning. There is a generational dimension. There is a credibility dimension that cuts to the very core of how political influence is constructed and maintained in the current era. The prominent figures who are now pivoting, the ones with significant audiences and established platforms, constructed their entire credibility architecture on a foundation of unwavering Trump defense. Their followers trusted them precisely because they were willing to articulate positions that other figures would not articulate. They were the reliable ones. They were the ones who would never break, never waver, never betray the cause. And now they are pivoting, and their audiences are fracturing in response. Some portion of those audiences follows the pivot. They trust their chosen influencer more than they trust the movement, and they adjust their orientation accordingly. Another portion, possibly the larger portion, interprets the pivot as just the latest in a long sequence of betrayals, and they respond by burrowing deeper into the hardcore MAGA remnant, their commitment intensified rather than diminished by the departure of the insufficiently faithful. The coalition is not simply hemorrhaging numerical support, it is losing coherence. It is losing the internal narrative logic that once held its disparate elements in rough alignment. And when a political movement loses its internal narrative logic, it does not dissolve quietly into the background noise. It becomes volatile. It becomes angry, it turns inward and begins consuming itself. That process is what we are observing in real time. Then there is the episode that distills the entire moral vacancy of this administration into a single, almost impossibly revealing moment. Andrew Schultz, the comedian and podcaster who endorsed Trump during the last election cycle, who lent him credibility with a younger, culturally connected demographic that traditional Republican politics has struggled to reach, who helped make the Trump affiliation feel less like a political statement and more like a lifestyle choice, watched the grandmother footage, and registered something that seemed to genuinely break through his defenses. Trump invited a grandmother to the White House, a woman named Sharon Simmons, who has been driving for DoorDash to pay for her husband's cancer treatment because the cost of medical care in this country is so comprehensively broken that a woman who should be enjoying retirement is instead navigating gig economy delivery routes to keep her spouse alive. Trump turned her entire existence into a photo opportunity for his no tax on tips talking point, which, it must be emphasized, is still not law. It has never been passed. It has never been implemented. It remains precisely what it was when it was first rolled out. A rhetorical device for creating the impression of populist concern without the substance of populist policy. And then, after using this woman's suffering as a backdrop for his own political branding exercise, he described her on camera as a little tacky. Pause and absorb the full architecture of what that sequence represents. A grandmother is working a gig economy job in her later years, not because she finds it fulfilling, but because the healthcare system of the wealthiest nation in human history has made it economically impossible for her to do otherwise. The president invites her to the White House not to announce a policy intervention that might alleviate her burden or the burdens of millions like her, but to use her as a human stage prop in a performance of empathy. And then, in a moment of unguarded irritation, he critiques her delivery skills on camera, revealing that the performance was never about her, was never about the cancer, was never about the systemic failure that reduced her to this circumstance. It was always and entirely about him. Andrew Schultz, a man who is not remotely a progressive, who has no history of left-wing activism, who actively campaigned for this president, observed that sequence and said aloud what tens of millions of Americans were already thinking. What country are we inhabiting where the argument being advanced is that a grandmother being forced to work DoorDash to cover medical expenses is somehow inspirational rather than damning? A grandmother delivering food to pay for chemotherapy is not a success narrative. It is a prosecutorial exhibit. It is evidence of a social compact that has been shredded, a safety net that has been dismantled, an economy that extracts labor from its most vulnerable citizens while celebrating their desperation as commendable work ethic. And instead of processing that indictment as a call to corrective action, the White House responded by asking the public to admire the hard work. Isn't it wonderful how industrious she is? No tips on that delivery, the president joked. The political cynicism embedded in that moment is almost physiologically difficult to process. The administration that cannot stop invoking the forgotten American, the working class hero, the everyday patriot looked at an actual forgotten American working an actual gig job to pay actual medical bills and saw not a constituency in need but a prop to be deployed and then discarded with a dismissive joke. And Schultz, by registering his disgust publicly, signaled something that the political class should be paying extremely close attention to. The vibe has shifted in cultural spaces that were never formally political, but that carry enormous political weight. The manosphere, the podcast ecosystem, the young male demographic that gravitated toward Trump because he represented a symbolic rejection of an establishment they despised. Those audiences are not automatically migrating to the Democratic Party. They are not suddenly enrolling as progressive activists, but they are watching. And what they are observing is not aligning with the product they were promised. The man who was sold to them as a fearless truth teller, an alpha who would never bow to convention, turns out to be someone who uses a grandmother fighting cancer as a visual aid and then mocks her behind her back. The Atlantic has published a comprehensive look at the fault lines spreading through the coalition, and the picture is one of simultaneous crises hitting every pillar of the Trump support structure at once. Religious conservatives are reportedly enraged that Trump posted an AI-generated image depicting himself as Jesus on social media. Not metaphorically, literally. He published an image that recast his own face onto the body of Christ and presented it to his followers as a shareable piece of content. The same religious conservatives who have spent years arguing that the left mocks their faith, that secular culture disrespects the sacred, just watch their standard bearer commit an act of blasphemous self-aggrandizement so flagrant that it would be difficult to satirize. And he was not finished. He went after the Pope, the first American Pope in the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. And Donald Trump, a man who has been credibly accused of sexual assault by more than 24 women, whose personal moral history is a matter of extensive public record, decided to describe the Bishop of Rome, the leader of the global Catholic communion, as weak on crime. The religious right, which has expended immense political capital rationalizing their support for a man whose personal conduct bears no resemblance to the values they claim to champion, is now being asked to absorb a direct assault on the spiritual leader of their own tradition. The insult is not subtle. It is not coded. It is a president of the United States publicly disparaging the Pope while simultaneously presenting himself as a divine figure. The theological incoherence of this position is matched only by its political recklessness. The manosphere influencers, the same ones who helped deliver young male voters to Trump in numbers that surprised the polling industry, are expressing confusion and frustration over the Epstein disclosures and the administration's handling of them. Immigration policy, the signature issue that was supposed to be the movement's electoral superweapon, is not delivering the promised outcomes. The Iran situation has escalated into a military quagmire that nobody in the coalition voted to initiate. And beneath all of these ideological and cultural fissures, a quieter but far more dangerous indicator is flashing. Small dollar donations are collapsing. The political media ecosystem tends to fixate on the super PACs, the billionaire donors, the dark money networks that can write 8-figure checks without blinking. But small dollar donations are the genuine pulse of a grassroots movement. They are not merely financial instruments. They are measures of emotional investment. When someone clicks the donate button and hands over $25 or $50, they are not making a strategic political calculation. They are expressing belief. They are saying, I am part of this. I feel something. This movement represents me. When those donations begin to dry up, it signals that the emotional investment is withdrawing. The people who were never capable of writing large checks, but who were motivated to contribute what they could because they believed in the project, are no longer feeling the motivation. That is not a fundraising challenge that can be solved with a sharper email subject line or a more urgent text message. That is a structural collapse of belief. And it is far more dangerous to the longevity of the movement than any single news cycle. Republican operatives embedded in battleground states are reportedly communicating to the White House that they would strongly prefer Trump not appear in their districts. Read that sentence again and let the implications settle. Members of his own party, individuals running for office who theoretically benefit from the association with the leader of their movement, are requesting that the leader stay away. Because a Trump visit to your district in the current environment is not an asset. It is a liability. His presence activates the opposition more than it energizes the base. His brand has become sufficiently toxic in competitive suburban and exurban territory that the local candidates who need to win those territories to maintain the majority are calculating that distance from him is safer than proximity. That is a historically abnormal condition for a sitting president within his own party. The White House, confronted with this cascade of internal disintegration, is reportedly planning a major strategy meeting at the Waldorf to address the economic messaging. They are putting their thinking caps on a year and a half into the administration and just now convening a meeting to strategize about how to talk about an economy that has been deteriorating on their watch. The economy is apparently being treated as a messaging challenge rather than a substantive crisis, a perception problem to be solved with better communication rather than a set of material conditions to be addressed with policy corrections. The analyst who drew the comparison to the Biden administration's economic blind spot was more accurate than the administration would like to admit. The Biden White House was warned repeatedly, forcefully, and by its own allies that the economy was being experienced as punishing by voters even when the aggregate statistics suggested strength. The unemployment rate was low. The GDP growth was solid. The wage gains were real, particularly at the bottom of the income distribution. But voters did not feel it. They felt the inflation. They felt the cost of groceries and gasoline and rent. And the Biden team kept insisting that the numbers were good, that people just did not understand, that eventually the sentiment would catch up to the data. They paid a catastrophic electoral price for that condescension. They were annihilated in the midterms, their messaging failure contributing directly to the loss of the House. Trump is now executing the same fundamental error, but with a crucial and damning difference. The Biden economy was wrestling with a global post-pandemic inflationary surge that had real exogenous causes, snarled supply chains, energy price shocks from the war in Ukraine, labor market disruptions that were affecting every developed economy simultaneously. Trump's economic instability is substantially self-inflicted. The tariff regime alone has injected a level of policy uncertainty into supply chains, small business planning, and consumer pricing that is generating precisely the volatility that markets hate and that households feel immediately. He is actively creating chaos and then turning to the public and demanding credit for managing it. The venue selected for this economic messaging offensive, a Turning Point USA gathering, reveals that the administration either does not understand its own problem or is unwilling to address it seriously. If your strategic objective is to reach disillusioned Republicans and wavering independents who are anxious about the cost of living and open to an alternative, you do not stage your outreach at an event organized by Charlie Kirk. A Turning Point USA rally is the political equivalent of walking into the home stadium of a team and attempting to persuade the visiting team's fans to switch their allegiance. You are speaking to an audience that is already fully converted, that already possesses the merchandise and knows all the chants. You are not expanding your coalition. You are performing for a base that is already locked in, delivering a greatest hits setlist to people who purchased the album years ago and have memorized every lyric. It is the political equivalent of Frank Sinatra in his late career phase, still capable of selling out a room of loyalists who fell in love with the voice decades earlier, but no longer a cultural force that shapes the direction of the music. The performances were technically sound. The room was warm with nostalgic affection, but something essential was absent. The edge was gone. The sense that this was the center of gravity, that this was where history was being written, had evaporated. That is Trump at Turning Point USA in the current moment. The people inside the auditorium will cheer. They are contractually obligated by their identity and their investment to cheer. But the millions of people watching from their living rooms, the ones who voted for him because they believed their lives would improve and are now facing $5 gasoline and $8 eggs and a notification from their health insurance provider explaining that their coverage is being altered in ways they do not fully understand, those people are not cheering. Those people are performing arithmetic at their kitchen tables late at night. And the results of that arithmetic are not favorable to the incumbent. The fractures that are now visible everywhere, the Marjorie Taylor Greene defection, the Candace Owens pivot, the random podcasters suddenly finding the courage of their convictions, the small dollar donors quietly closing their digital wallets, the Republican operatives in swing districts who are dodging the president's advance team are not disconnected data points. They are symptoms of a single underlying condition. Structures, whether architectural, organizational, or political, do not typically issue formal announcements before they fail. What occurs instead is an accumulation of small cracks, each individually dismissible, each easy for a determined defender to minimize as cosmetic. The crack appears in the drywall, and someone says it is just settling. Another crack appears, and someone says it is just the humidity. The process repeats until one day a load-bearing element shifts, and the entire structure comes down without further warning. The cracks are propagating right now across every surface of the MAGA coalition. Economic dissatisfaction, cultural backlash from religious conservatives, confusion and anger from the manosphere, fear of war from the isolationist wing, disgust from the Epstein-aware segment, exhaustion from the normie voters who just wanted life to become a little more manageable. Each crack by itself is a manageable communication problem. The existence of all of them simultaneously, hitting different constituencies in different ways but all activating within the same compressed time frame, is an altogether different category of challenge. This is a coalition that does not have a singular vulnerability that can be patched with a well-deployed speech or a targeted ad buy. It has a dozen vulnerabilities all triggering at once, and the available attention and resources are insufficient to address them all. The strategic question that Democrats have never resolved cleanly is whether to welcome the defectors or to hold the line. And the honest answer is that the only viable approach is to do both simultaneously and to do them with a clarity of purpose that distinguishes between audiences. You welcome the voters, the regular people, the Sharon Simmonses of the electorate. You meet them exactly where they are. You do not demand that they perform penance or recite progressive catechisms as a condition of entry. You say, plainly and without condescension, that the door is open, that their grievances are legitimate, that they were sold a bill of goods, and that there is a political project available to them that takes their material needs seriously. You offer them policy, not lectures. You offer them tangible improvements in their lives, not demands that they atone for their prior voting record. But the politicians, the influencers, the media figures, the grifters who constructed entire professional identities on defending this administration and attacking its critics, you do not extend to them the gift of a rehabilitation platform. You do not invite them onto your podcast to narrate their personal growth journey. You do not write the glowing long-form profile that describes their courageous evolution. Because the moment you do, you are providing the exact service they are seeking, laundering their reputations, facilitating their pivot without accountability, granting them the clean slate they crave without requiring them to account for the damage they inflicted when the political cost of that damage was being borne entirely by others. Accountability is not vengeance. Vengeance is personal and emotional. Accountability is procedural and institutional. It is the insistence that the historical record remain complete and uncorrupted. It is the refusal to permit individuals who wielded immense power and influence and who deliberately chose to deploy that power in a specific destructive direction to quietly detach from the consequences of that choice the instant it becomes politically inconvenient. It is the maintenance of a public memory that does not reset every news cycle, that can hold in mind simultaneously the Marjorie Taylor Greene who tormented school shooting survivors and the Marjorie Taylor Greene who is now dissatisfied with Trump, and that refuses to privilege the latter over the former merely because the latter is more useful to the current political project. Everything circles back to the midterms. That is the arena in which the theoretical fractures either become a durable political realignment or are revealed to be nothing more than noise. If, despite all the buyer's remorse and the donor flight and the operatives hiding from the president's schedule, Republicans manage to maintain control of the House and the Senate, then the story of this period will be written as one in which the coalition survived its internal stresses, that the structure was stronger than the visible cracks suggested. But if Democrats can coalesce around the genuine economic frustrations of genuine voters, not simply the liberal base but the grandmothers working gig jobs to finance cancer treatments, the people who cast ballots for Trump because they were convinced he would make their lives more affordable and have watched that promise evaporate. If Democrats can address those voters with clarity, specificity, and the kind of respect that does not talk down or moralize, then the MAGA fractures become the foundation for something larger than a favorable news cycle. They become the raw material of a political realignment, the kind that only comes around once or twice in a political lifetime. The window for that kind of organizing is open at this moment in a way it has not been since before the political world was upended. And the question hovering over the entire enterprise is whether the people who should be walking through that window recognize its existence and are prepared to act. Because Trump is not changing. He is constitutionally incapable of change. He called a grandmother tacky on camera while using her suffering as a branding exercise. He posted an image of himself as the incarnate deity of Christianity. He is publicly feuding with the Pope while his religious conservative supporters struggle to formulate an explanation that does not collapse into absurdity. He is making promises that do not become policy and issuing threats that do not become strategy. None of the core dynamics that produce this crisis of confidence are being corrected. What has shifted is not the president. What has shifted is the audience. The list of who is paying attention just expanded dramatically, and the new additions to that list are not liking what they see.